From her earliest days, she terrified those around her by seeking adventure and excitement. As a girl, she was a real-life Pippi Longstocking, building a roller coaster in her backyard and riding a sled through the legs of a passing horse. She believed that women could accomplish anything if just given the chance, and she sought her own fulfillment in aviation. She became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, first as a passenger, then as a pilot. She was the first person to fly across the Pacific, broke a dozen different speed records, and became the most famous woman of her time. In 1937, on a highly publicized flight around the world, she disappeared without a trace. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to her. She is Amelia Earhart, and she is a legend of air power. Amelia Earhart was born in Atchison, Kansas on July 24, 1897. Her father, Edwin, was a charming alcoholic lawyer whose career was on a downward trajectory. Her mother, Amy, was the prim daughter of a wealthy and socially prominent Kansas family. Amelia was raised primarily in her grandparents' home in Atchison. As a young girl, she defied the norms of female behavior. She climbed trees, hunted rats with her .22 caliber rifle, and rode her sled head first downhill.
She loved boys' games. When she went to school, she learned how to play basketball and baseball, and then she taught all her girlfriends. They played all the boys' games. She was like the Pied Piper. Whatever she did, all the other kids wanted to do also.
When Amelia was 12, she and her sister went to live with her parents in Des Moines. The family was stable for only a few years before the railroad for which her father worked demoted him and transferred him to St. Paul, Minnesota. That move didn't solve any of Edwin's problems. In 1914, unemployed and desperate, he moved his family to Springfield, Illinois, where he abandoned them. Amelia, her mother, and sister Muriel moved to Chicago. At Hyde Park High School, Amelia was a loner, a pretty girl who seemed to distrust the motives of those around her. She was embarrassed by her family's financial condition and embittered by her father's abandonment. In her high school yearbook, she is described as A.E., the girl in brown who walks alone. After she graduated, an inheritance from her grandmother allowed her to attend the exclusive Organt School in Philadelphia. On a Christmas visit to Toronto in 1917, she encountered a group of wounded soldiers returning from the war in Europe. She was nearly undone by the suffering she saw, young men rendered helpless by tuberculosis and mustard gas. The encounter changed her life. She enlisted as a volunteer nurse's aide at the Spadina Military Hospital in Toronto and spent the next year tending to the needs of the most desperately wounded. In Toronto, she also had her first real encounters with aviation. Many of the wounded she cared for were pilots, and they regaled the pretty young nurse's aide with stories of their exploits in the sky. On a walk through the countryside with a friend, she watched a group of planes flying overhead, and one of the pilots dived down in an attempt to scare her. Amelia's friend dove for cover, but Amelia stood fast as the plane passed only a few feet over her head. After growing ill herself, she joined her mother and sister in Northampton, Massachusetts, where Muriel was preparing to attend Smith College. Amelia, pursuing her own interest without regard for what anyone else thought, took class in auto mechanics before enrolling in Columbia University in New York. A pre-med major, she was determined to be a doctor, no matter how much everyone else thought she should do the ladylike thing and become a nurse. In 1919, her parents reconciled and moved to California. Amelia left Columbia to visit with them, hopeful that her family would at long last stabilize. On Christmas Day, 1919, her father took her out to Glendale Airport for a ride in a Curtiss Jenny. It was his Christmas present to her.
And she got in the airplane and took the ride, and records later that as soon as she did that, she was absolutely convinced that this was the outlet that she'd been looking for all of her life.
The girl who had always enjoyed climbing high and taking risks, who could never go fast enough or have enough of an adventure, didn't return to college. She announced to her parents, "I think I'd like to fly," and went looking for a job to pay for flying lessons. For the next year, she worked as a file clerk, an office assistant, a photographer, and a truck driver. She searched for and found a female flight instructor, convinced that she would learn faster if taught by a woman. She eventually signed up to take lessons from Nita Snook, one of the first female pilots in the country.
They were about the same age, and they had pretty much the same background, and they both gone to college, and they were fast friends for a while, but actually Netta thought that Amelia took too many risks, and she thought she was foolhardy.
On December 15, 1921, Amelia Earhart passed her pilot's test and was issued her very first license to fly. Her mother and sister helped her buy her first airplane, a Kinner Airster that her flight instructor, Nita, thought was too dangerous to fly. But Earhart could not be dissuaded, and for the next 3 years, she flew every chance she got. As the roaring 20s roared around her, Earhart got her kicks taking chances in the air over Southern California.
Now, being a female aviator wasn't exactly acceptable at that time, but it was more acceptable than grabbing hold of the jazz age and becoming one of the flaming youth and drowning in bathtub gin, which was something that her Victorian upbringing simply would not allow.
So she flew, developing a reputation as a pilot that bordered on the irresponsible. She buzzed her friends on the ground, turned terrifying spirals through the air over Los Angeles, and even flew her plane between telephone wires for the sheer exhilaration of taking a risk. And it didn't seem to matter who disapproved of her actions. She went right ahead and did what she felt like doing. After learning to fly, Amelia Earhart spent 2 years in Southern California doing nothing but flying. In 1922, she got her first taste of fame when she set the unofficial women's altitude record, flying her plane up to over 14,000 feet. The brief flurry of recognition quickly settled, and she went back to being just another pilot. In 1924, her parents separated again. The sinus infections that had bothered her since her time in Toronto returned, and she was hospitalized. Depressed at once again being torn between the life she was expected to lead and the one she wanted, she sold her planes to pay off her debts. She bought a car and drove with her mother to Boston, where her sister was in school. Unbeknownst to anyone else, Amelia brought with her a file of newspaper articles she had collected. The collection featured article after article on women who had broken out of their traditional roles to become doctors, lawyers, and even champion sharpshooters. Earhart returned to Columbia for a year, but couldn't afford to continue. She returned to Boston and took a job teaching immigrant children, and then became a social worker at a settlement house. She started flying again as a sales representative for Wilfred Kinner, who had built the plane she'd owned in California. She joined the local chapter of the National Aeronautics Association and began to correspond with noted women aviators about forming an organization for women who flew. In 1928, she came to the attention of George Putnam. Putnam, of the Putnam & Sons publishing family, was the aviation dilettante who had published Charles Lindbergh's account of his transatlantic flight. The blizzard of attention Lindbergh's flight had generated changed Putnam's life. A fierce competitor and opportunist, he grasped instantly aviation's potential for generating fame and fortune. he instantly repositioned himself as the publicist to aviation stars and adventurers of all types. It has been said of generals that they are always preparing to fight the last war. The same thing can well be said of publicists like Putnam. They're always preparing to recreate the last craze. When the first planned transatlantic flight by a woman fell through, Putnam took the project over. He contacted Amy Guest, the wealthy heiress who had originally planned to make the flight. He convinced her to let him use the Fokker F-7 she had purchased and outfitted if he could find a suitable female to make the flight.
Actually, it was his representative that found Amelia Earhart in Boston, was just absolutely bowled over by her. And then when George Palmer Putnam met her, he was bowled over by her too. And then the Guest family were equally impressed, so nobody but Amelia Earhart was ever interviewed.
Putnam plugged Earhart into the flight that had been planned for Guest. Attracted by her tomboyish good looks, thin figure, and modest Midwestern demeanor, he envisioned her as a female version of Charles Lindbergh. He christened her Lady Lindy and prepared to recreate the publicity blitz he'd put together for Lindbergh. Initially put off by Putnam, Earhart could not turn down a hard offer to be the first woman to fly the Atlantic. She said at the time, "How could I refuse such a shining adventure?" and left, once and for all, the quiet life of a children's social worker behind her. On the 5th anniversary of Lindbergh's New York to Paris flight, Earhart and co-pilots Wilmer Stutz and Lewis Gordon climbed into the Fokker, which had been named the Friendship. They took off from an airfield in Newfoundland, bound for Great Britain. The adventure was not, perhaps, as shining as she envisioned. Nominally the captain of the flight, Earhart was in fact little more than a passenger. She sat quietly in the cockpit while Stutz and Gordon did the flying. More than 20 hours after takeoff, the Friendship landed in Berryport, Wales. Putnam had done his job well. The flight made headlines all over the world, and those headlines barely mentioned the two men who had done most of the flying. Instead, they focused almost exclusively on Amelia Earhart.
He essentially created her from the ground up in terms of her promotional self, which was far different than the very quiet and introspective Amelia that her friends knew. And many people were not comfortable with their relationship and with the way that he appeared to exploit her.
Exploited or not, Earhart went along willingly. Though she abhorred being referred to as Lady Lindy, she also recognized that Putnam's stunts enabled her to pursue aviation full-time. He published a quickie memoir of her transatlantic flight that became a bestseller. He got her a job as aviation editor of Cosmopolitan, a magazine that had not shown previous interest in aeronautics. She became the first woman to fly coast to coast across the United States. She bought a Lockheed Vega and used it in air races all over the country. She competed in the first Women's Air Derby, a race from Santa Monica, California to Cleveland, Ohio, and came in third. She set the world women's airspeed record of 181 miles an hour. She signed deals with advertisers, designed a line of luggage, and endorsed a line of women's clothing. She became a sought-after speaker and attraction at air shows. At the same time, she worked diligently to attract women to aviation. She organized and served as president of the 99s, an organization of female pilots that exists to this day.
She proved that women could fly, and she did the things that many men were doing. So in that respect, she had a very important impact on what became the United States Air Force, because she proved that women could do this too. And it was harder to say, no, women can't fly, but all you had to do was bring out a picture of Amelia Earhart, and everyone knew who she was.
The young woman who had secretly accumulated a file full of articles about women doing things that only men were supposed to do became an inspiration for the generation of girls who grew up to invent the women's movement. She turned Putnam's publicity machine into one of the driving forces for the growth of aviation, particularly among women. And then, in 1931, she did something that shocked the world. She married Putnam, the man who had given her career wings. When Amelia Earhart and George Putnam first met, she was engaged and he was married. 3 years later, when Earhart and Putnam cast off their previous entanglements to marry each other, there was considerable speculation about the nature of their relationship. Their marriage seemed to many based more on business than emotion. The marriage didn't slow down Earhart's aviation career. 2 months after their wedding, Earhart bought an autogyro, a type of aircraft that never moved out of the novelty category, and went to work setting records in it. She went higher than anyone ever had before, and flew the autogyro cross-country under the sponsorship of the Beechnut Company. She wrote another book, and then flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean, making up for the fact that on her highly publicized first flight, she had not really flown at all. Putnam put together publishing and endorsement deals, and Earhart flew the missions. She set and then broke the coast-to-coast speed record for women. She became the first person to fly from Hawaii to the mainland, a flight hyped by Putnam as the first flight across the Pacific, though it covered less than half the ocean's diameter. She won 3 consecutive Harmon trophies as the outstanding female aviator, and President Herbert Hoover presented her with the gold medal of the National Geographic Society. She flew solo from Los Angeles to Mexico City at the invitation of the Mexican government, and on the return trip became the first person to fly non-stop from Mexico City to Newark. That a flight from Mexico City to Newark made headlines is tribute to Putnam's skills as a publicist, but what he could not finesse was the fact that Earhart was growing tired. As her activities in support of women had grown more important to her, flying had become less. As a consultant to Purdue University, she had seen co-ed enrollment skyrocket just by her mere presence on campus. A generation of girls that she had inspired was coming of age, and she no longer felt the need to prove herself by flying made-up missions for the newsreel cameras. Together, Earhart and Putnam dreamed up one last headline-grabbing flight for Earhart to finish on. It would be, without question, the greatest achievement of both of their careers. And when it was done, Earhart would settle down and pursue her broader interests. The Purdue Research Foundation chipped in for a new airplane, a brand new Lockheed Electra. The plane, after the round-the-world flight, would come back to Purdue for use by Earhart to do research on various aspects of flight. She took delivery of the craft in July 1936 and went to work planning her flight.
There have been a lot of round-the-world flights, but never at the equator, and basically had never been done because everybody was still scared of flying the whole width of the Pacific Ocean. Huge, no plane could make it.
Even with the Electra's oversized fuel tanks, the trip would require pinpoint navigational accuracy. Earhart would have to find tiny islands in the vast ocean and land on them with little fuel to spare, hopscotching across the Pacific with almost no margin for error. In March 1937, she set out around the world. Putnam had the publicity machine wound up to full throttle. When Earhart took off from Oakland, California, the whole world was watching. A few days later, when she set out on the next leg of her journey, she crashed on takeoff.
She claimed to hit a wet spot. People who were watching said the wing dipped and she ended up ground looping. But whatever happened, she ended up knocking off her landing gear and the plane had to go in for repairs.
Earhart recuperated at her friend Jackie Cochran's ranch in California. When she told the story of the Hawaii crack-up, Cochran and her husband, Floyd Odlum, sat in stony silence.
She said, well, what's wrong? Aren't you guys going to talk me into going back and doing it again? And nobody said a word except Jackie, who said very quietly, "I really hope you don't."
Undaunted, on June 1st, Earhart took off from Miami on her redesigned west to east route. Each time she took off and each time she landed, the headlines flashed around the world. She stopped in South America and in Africa, taking the route in legs that were manageable for the airplane and that could be manipulated to generate publicity. She crossed the Middle East, the Asian subcontinent, and the jungles of Southeast Asia. Back home, her husband fueled the publicity fires. The world had never seen anything like this, a 5-week flight around the world with near real-time reporting furnished by ship's telegraphers and the emerging medium of radio. On July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off from the landing strip at Lae, New Guinea, headed for tiny Halland Island. It was without question the hardest leg of her journey, a long flight that had to culminate at a speck of land barely 20 feet above sea level and more than 2,500 miles away. It was the last anyone saw of Amelia Earhart, her navigator, and the Lockheed Electra.
Of course, nobody knows for sure what happened. If you were to have asked her friend Jackie Cochran, who claimed to be psychic, she believed that she got a psychic picture of Amelia floating in the ocean with her airplane not too far off Halland Island for about 3 days before she and Noonan and the plane finally sank.
President Roosevelt ordered the largest, most expensive search and rescue operation the world had ever seen. For weeks, Navy ships and aircraft scoured the area around Halland Island, but nothing was ever found of Amelia Earhart. Ever since, different theories have been advanced about what happened. There are those who believe that Earhart was on a secret spy mission, captured and killed by the Japanese as they expanded their empire toward World War II. Others have speculated that Earhart and Noonan were secretly in love, and they spent the rest of their lives together on an idyllic Pacific island. The reality is probably as simple as this: a small error in navigation, a short circuit in a radio receiver, and a journey that, under the best of circumstances, would have ended with only a few minutes of fuel to spare. Somewhere below the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean, Amelia Earhart's final airplane awaits discovery. To this day, there are people who continue to search.